of yore from Britain's shore, Wolfe the dauntless hero came and planted firm Britannia's flag on Canada's fair domain. Here may to wave our boast, our pride, and joined in love together, the thistle, shamrock, rose, entwine, the maple leaf forever. The maple leaf, our emblem dear, the maple leaf forever. God save our Queen, and heaven bless the maple leaf forever. At Queenston Heights and Lundy's Lane, our brave fathers, side by side, for freedom, homes, and loved ones dear, firmly stood and nobly died. And those dear rights which they maintained, we swear to yield them never. Our watchword evermore shall be the maple leaf forever. The maple leaf, our emblem dear, the maple leaf forever. God save our Queen, and heaven bless the maple leaf forever. Our fair dominion now extends from Cape Race to Nootka Sound. May peace forever be our lot, and plenteous store abound. And may those ties of love be ours, which discord cannot sever, and flourish green o'er freedom's home, the maple leaf forever. The maple leaf, our emblem dear, the maple leaf forever. God save our Queen, and heaven bless the maple leaf forever.
On this day, 200 years ago. The War of 1812 had been raging for the better part of 3 years. All the American attacks into Canada had been blunted. The British had taken the war to the United States. Washington, D.C. had been burned, and even though the British had some success, they're halted at Baltimore. In a particular fort, you probably heard a song about it, the War of 1812, with its rockets, red glare, and its bombs bursting in air. And those same sort of weapons were here at Cook's Mills 200 years ago. So at the end of the year, the Americans have had these redcoats storming in and burning their capital. But for some reason, they send a big reinforcement of troops to Niagara, and they want to keep the offensive going here because they've been bottled up from the campaign of 1840, which is the worst campaign of the war. It starts at the beginning of July when a well-trained, well-prepared American army crosses over from Buffalo, New York. They capture little Fort Erie. They beat up the redcoats at a place called Chippewa, and then they really get into a vicious brawl along a farmer's lane in Niagara Falls, of course, at Lundy's Lane. And that doesn't end. The Americans withdraw back to Fort Erie, where there's a siege that goes on for a couple of months, thousands of casualties. And then the Americans get all these reinforcements, the British pull back to Chippewa. Over the ground they fought over for the past couple of years. So there's a new American general named George Izzard, or Izzard, depending on what part of the state you come from. And he takes this big American army, the biggest American army that will be on the Niagara Peninsula in the War of 1812. He's got over 7,000 men, and he marches up to Chippewa, and he tries to convince the British to come out and fight him, like they did in July. But the British have learned that the Americans have become very good soldiers. So they stay put. They stay hidden in Fort Chippewa, with the creek in front of them. And that's where Cook's Mills comes into it. What General Izzard decides to do is do a bit of a left hook. He's going to send soldiers west of Chippewa. And the reason there's a battle here, well, it's kind of in the hamlet's name. It has mills. And mills were considered a legitimate military target. Armies marched on their stomachs. That little French emperor, I think, said that, the Napoleon guy. And if you destroy mills, you destroy the ability of your enemy to produce food. So that's why Cook's Mills was a legitimate target. It also didn't hurt that there was a small distillery here. That always helps if soldiers are looking for a reason to attack a place. So they weren't really going after the town so much. They wanted to do a hook around and take out Chippewa. So they come here in October. They march from Chippewa. They bring about 1,200 men under the command of an excellent young American general. He's done a pretty good job through the war, named Daniel Bizzle. And they get here on the 18th, and literally Pearson Road, for local folks out here, literally goes down across a little bridge. And right there was where the bridge was that the Americans crossed. And they pushed some men across the bridge. So he's got 4 regiments of infantry. He's got some riflemen who are the sharpshooters. He's even got some cavalry. Now confronting him are a group of guys who come from Chippewa as well, from Fort Chippewa. And they're under the command of a guy named Christopher Myers. He's got a group of Canadians called the Glengarry Light Infantry, and he's got his own men of the 82nd Regiment of Foot. In the middle of the night, around midnight on the 19th, they bump into each other about a mile from where the battlefield is. People ask, well, where is the battlefield? Well, we're going to pretend this is it today, but we're a little off. The battlefield, you know where the cairn is, where the National Historic Site marker is. Go to that marker today on Lions Creek Road. Just head east a little bit, maybe 200 yards, and the road dips down into a ravine. That ravine is the center of all the fighting of the Battle of Cook's Mills. The Americans hold that ravine, and for a while the British try to push them out, but there's way more Americans than there are British guys in the battle. So eventually, the Americans do overwhelm the Redcoats, and they have to withdraw. Both sides have sort of learned to respect each other. They're very evenly matched in their abilities and their technology. And by the end of the war, they're very wary of another big fight that could drag both sides with heavy, heavy casualties. But that still means that over 100 men are killed or wounded at the Battle of Cook's Mills. It's not a huge battle per se, but at the same time, you have to think of what the population is today and what it was back then. So the population of North America is 50 times larger than it was in 1814. The Niagara campaign between July and the end of October of 1814 saw almost 7,000 casualties on the Niagara Peninsula. So you multiply that by 50, and that would be the equivalent effect today. So there was not a town, a hamlet, a native community in North America that in some way was left untouched by this war. It's a pretty serious thing for the people living back then. So the Americans, they eventually have to leave too. They're not going to make it all the way to Fort Chippewa. So they actually destroy the grain. But unlike what had been going on the previous year, they don't burn the town. There's two versions of why they don't burn them. The British commander, a Canadian-born guy named Gordon Drummond, he's convinced it's because we had admonished the Americans by burning their capital that they wouldn't dare burn another Canadian town. Well, I'll give a little credit to the American commander. He was a professional soldier, and he felt that the burning of Cook's Mills would be beneath him. He's not going to destroy people's homes right before a Canadian winter is about to set in. But he does his job and wrecks the food. So as I mentioned at the commemorative service this morning, that winter was going to be a long, hungry winter for the people living in what's now the city of Welland. So when people come to these events, and they look at us in July, and say, aren't you warm and all that stuff? Aren't you sweating and all that wool? Not so funny anymore, is it? Wool is a magical fiber. It'll keep you warm even when it's wet. And if you layer it up enough, you can stand pretty rough weather. But at the same time, the advantage of having native allies is that you can also have access to furs. So if it gets really cold, you'd have fur boots, fur mitts, and fur hats to go with your wool uniform. So you're right. In July and August, it's a lot of stuff to wear. But in many ways, they're wearing what they're going to be fighting in, sleeping in. You just put your uniform on at the beginning of the campaign, and you took it off sometime in November when the snow started to fly. Yeah, pretty stinky. But everybody wants to know, why on earth would you wear a bright red coat with a large white "Shoot Me Here" X painted on your chest, and a big dumb hat, and walk upright onto a battlefield? So the folks close to me will be able to see it, and you'll see all the guys come onto the field in a minute.
You guys, can you tuck over a bit?
So every soldier has a musket. This is what British troops affectionately called brown vests. The American soldiers are carrying a French-designed musket. It's much prettier than poor old vest here. And it's not a very good gun. It's very unreliable because the firing mechanism's on the outside. So if it's raining or it's really windy or you splash through a river, it's useless. And even on a sunny day like today, with a clean musket, it works about 80% of the time. So you want a lot of your friends around to make sure something's going to go boom when you pull the triggers. The other problem is that it's not a rifle. There's no grooves down the barrel to make the ball spiral out. It's very inaccurate. You'd be hard-pressed to aim and hit a man deliberately past the length of a soccer field, about 100 yards. If you did hit him, you were either really lucky or he was really unlucky. Now, they did have rifles with 3 times the range, so 3 soccer fields long, you could deliberately aim and hit a guy, but a rifle had 2 drawbacks. It was very slow to load, even slower than a musket, and it cost 4 times more to manufacture. So most American and British soldiers carried smoothbore, flintlock muskets. The elite of the U.S. Army had rifles in their rifle regiments, and on the British and Canadian side, a lot of the rifled muskets just went to the native warriors because they just made better snipers, essentially, than British soldiers. So the other weird thing about these guns, they're really long, so the fastest way to load them is to stand up, which is kind of dumb, isn't it, on a battlefield with all that lead flying around. And you'll see soldiers kneeling, even laying down, and even the redcoats were trained to do that. But if you want to win a battle, you had to pump out more lead than the other team, and the only way you were going to do that is if you stood up. Now, when all else failed, you could go to your bayonet. And a bayonet was sort of, it's going to sound strange, an anti-tank weapon. They didn't have tanks back then, but they had cavalry. So this big, long, pointy thing, pointed at a horse, the horse is generally smarter than the guy on it. So the horse might throw the rider onto the bayonet, but the horse won't throw itself onto your bayonet. The other problem these guns have is nobody had invented smokeless gunpowder. So the visibility on a battlefield deteriorates really bad. And There's accounts from soldiers on both sides. And on a clear, calm day like today, the first time they saw the enemy was at about 30 or 40 paces. So a guy steps out of the smoke, and he's wearing a color you don't recognize. You shoot him. You follow? So we have a red team, and we have a blue team. Leafs, Habs.
Wrong sport.
Now, there are a few fellows out there who are wearing camouflage. They think they're pretty smart or schmarmy. Guess who shoots at them? Everybody shoots the guy that can. So it seems ridiculous, but they wanted to avoid something that today we call friendly fire, which back then they would have called stupidity. And even in the 20th century, with smokeless gunpowder, with radios, with GPS, with night vision, it's estimated that close to a third of battlefield casualties are inflicted by your own team. So we have to be very careful about saying they were dumb back then. So we've had to come up with ways to make sure we don't accidentally shoot our own people 200 years later. But on the battlefield back then, they did have foot soldiers, they had cavalry. They were kind of scary, heavily armed guys who could run you down. But the real damage on a battlefield was done by cannons. And the cannons that you're going to see on the field are field guns that were the style that was used back then. And you have to think of a field gun the way a soldier today would use a machine gun. A modern machine gun, the bullets come out one at a time, really, really, really fast. Back then, you just put all the bullets in a cannon, and they came out all at once. So the British called it case shot. The Americans called it canister. That's a better name, I think. It's just a tin can filled with iron golf balls. So when you fire the cannon, iron golf balls go flying out about a quarter mile, almost a half a kilometer, mowing down anything that gets in the way. Once the enemy gets about 200 yards away, 2 soccer fields away, you're loaded with light canister, which is the same tin can filled with iron musket balls. So now you have potentially hundreds of these things flying at you. A good cannon crew could fire its cannon faster than an individual soldier could fire his musket. So they could pump out a lot of lead. But I mentioned that American song about a rocket's red glare and bombs bursting in air. At the Battle of Cook's Mills, there was a detachment of Royal Marine Artillery who brought Congreve rockets. Now these rockets just look like humongous bottle rockets. And they really scared inexperienced troops and horses. They made a lot of smoke, they made a screeching sound, and they had this eerie red glow at night when you launched them. They had one tiny downside. When you launched a Congreve rocket, sometimes it would turn around and come back. So you needed a ton of Congreve rockets and a really good hiding place to avoid getting blown up by your own rockets. The other thing that the British artillery have firing out of their cannon at Cook's Mills is invented by a guy you've heard before. His name is Henry Shrapnel. And Shrapnel built a better bomb, only the British had them. And this would allow you to fire an exploding shell out of your cannon, and hopefully it would detonate right in front of the enemy battle line and spray them with what we now call shrapnel. I don't think he wanted his name to live on with that sort of memory. So that's an advantage that they had on the British side, that they had rockets and Shrapnel's new bombs to shoot at the Americans. So the American troops are better trained. They've got good leadership now. And we had a lady in the crowd yesterday who was adamant that before she left, she wanted to see a good flogging. I hope none of you folks are into that. We're trying to avoid getting flogged in the Army here. And in 1812, the Americans decided to stop flogging their men. It wasn't good for recruiting to tell people you're going to be whipped for every infraction. But this is where things kind of changed. People say, wow, the American Army got a lot tougher and more disciplined, because their commanders made it very clear they weren't messing around anymore. So as a redcoat, if I ran away from my fort or garrison and they caught me, they dragged me back and tear off my coat and shirt and hit me with a cat of nine tails 100 times. Make a terrible mess of your back. But in a bit of time, you're expected to be back in the ranks. And all of your regiment would have to assemble to watch this punishment. Now, if I was a blue-coated American soldier and I ran away during the War of 1812 and they caught me, they dragged me back. Everybody'd have to come out and watch, and I'd dig a hole in the ground and they'd shoot me into it. Do you see the fundamental difference between the two concepts? So, if an American soldier was scared of the Redcoats at the beginning of the War of 1812, don't worry, he's probably more scared of his own commanders by the end of the War of 1812. The U.S. Army isn't very big. It has more than 20,000 men in it, and in a war that lasts 2.5 years, they execute about 230 of their own men to put some discipline into them. So life could be pretty rough for these guys. But they all volunteered. Sounds crazy. Now, every citizen, every subject living in North America, every guy was expected to be a part-time soldier. And at least once a year you had to show up to do some drill, and do a little bit of military training. But in Canada it was always on the King's birthday. In the States it was the 4th of July. Most fellas showed up because it was free beer, and then at night there'd be fireworks for the kids. So that was the main reason guys would show up. But to volunteer for the Army, it meant that you could get a land grant at the end of your service. A Redcoat got 100 acres. The Americans were eventually offering 160 acres for a blue-jacketed soldier. You got paid. Usually got 2 meals a day. You got free beer or rum or whiskey, usually a bit of free tobacco, and you got an enlistment bounty. So when you joined up, they'd offer you this money. They wouldn't give it to you right away, but at the end of your service, if you survived, you get what was left of your enlistment bounty and your land grant. If you didn't survive, your family could get it. And then with land, they could be real citizens. They could vote, they could hold government office if you survived. So let's see, I'm getting enlistment bounty, free booze, free land. What do we give young people to join the Canadian Army today? Is there a big enlistment bounty? No. Free booze anymore? No more free booze. A land grant at the end? No. So just give that some thought when you think people were dumber back then. It took a lot more actually to convince them to enlist, to serve. You had to give them real stuff to convince them to put on a uniform, because life could be pretty dangerous. So the other thing we get asked about, because again, we think we're a lot smarter today, why do they wear these big dumb hats? That is a big dumb hat I'm wearing, and you're going to see some big dumb hats in the field. In the 1790s, the top hat became popular, and generals back then were like little kids dressing up G.I. Joe or Barbie. Whatever looked cool, so the soldiers got these big tall hats, basically. I don't see a lot of men wearing berets here today. It's maybe not a fashionable headdress in the civilian world. It doesn't have a brim on it, so your face is exposed to the sun and rain. It doesn't have a rain flap to keep the rain and sun off the back of your neck. It's made of wool, but it's not like a toque. It won't keep you warm, but it's made of wool, so in the summer your head sweats. Are you following me here? So that's the recurring thing. Dumb hats is a great military tradition that we carry on with today. And just a few years ago, our American friends just wore a baseball cap in their army, but that wasn't cool enough. So they got rid of their practical baseball caps and just issued every American soldier with a beret, so he would look cool and sunburnt and wet and uncomfortable. So military service isn't always smart. So the great thing about the reenacting community that comes here, they're all volunteers. They come from all over North America. There's folks here who come up from Ohio and Pennsylvania, all throughout New York State, folks from all over Ontario. Sometimes the Americans are in red coats. Sometimes the Canadians are in blue coats. So that makes it actually safer. You know, nobody's actually going to try to hurt each other out there. But I always warn folks, this isn't totally over. Some of these guys are going to go to an event in New Orleans in January to mark the 200th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans. And then in June, in Europe, in Belgium, is the 200th anniversary of the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte, that little French dude who kind of caused all this trouble in the first place. So this is when you're walking around after the battle. You're more than welcome to talk to the reenactors, but be wary of sergeants giving out free beer. They might try to recruit you into their latest campaign. Now, you can support the event in a number of ways. You can grab some food while you're here, do a bit of shopping in the neat little shops that are here. You're also going to find some nice folks going up and down the line here And you can put a loonie or a toonie or a buck or two in those little buckets, and that'll help defray some of the basic costs of putting on this event. But there wouldn't be an event here if it wasn't for these volunteers volunteering not only their time, but all their equipment, the gas money to get here. They put quite a bit of effort into this. And what they've done for historians is really drilled down into the lives of everyday people. And just in the past couple of years, the incredible stories they've discovered of what individuals went through. And part of it comes from online, on the internet. People are doing a lot of genealogical study now. So people often thought they had no connection to the War of 1812. Why would I be interested in this? And then they discovered they had family in the War of 1812. So if your family's been in North America for 200 years, again, guaranteed, somehow these events would have touched the family, often in a very negative way. And that's where we find when we come to these events now, the questions we get from people are really good. So good, we can't answer them often. So the level of knowledge and detail that people have found in just the past couple of years during the bicentennial has been pretty impressive. And it's added to the depth of knowledge of what happened to common people, regular folks living their lives when the War of 1812 sort of landed. It's also, again, important that in a community like Cook's Mills, there's still families visiting here today who are the descendants of the people who originally settled this community. And that's kind of cool that they've been able to come back here. Yeah, a round of applause. This is somebody's home still today. They've been here for 200 years. They'll be here for another 200 more. Now, the one group that isn't entirely represented here today, but was incredibly important, they didn't fight in the Battle of Cook's Mills. They're on their way here. And that was First Nations warriors. So the Native warriors brought a certain psychological effect to the battlefield. Scared the pants off of everybody. But they also made for very good marksmen, very good soldiers. You're in Canada today because for most of the war, Native warriors fought alongside the Redcoats of the British Army and the Canadian militia. Oh, that's good. Round of applause for that. Ongwe Howe Otashon. Well, it looks like the pickets are bumping into each other here. So there's some red-coated light infantry that's gone on the field. And they bumped into a picket of American militiamen.
Here comes the other one.
But the redcoats better be careful because at high speed there are American reinforcements coming on the field. So at this point in the battle, they're fighting in a way that modern soldiers might recognize. You pair up with one other soldier, and as you're loading your weapon, your partner is looking for a target and shooting at it. When you're reloaded, it's their turn. And this is what was called light infantry tactics. And even the redcoats knew how to do this sort of thing. So the soldiers on both sides were told to look for cover and concealment. But again, we got blue coats and red coats here. Being a drummer in the Army back then was a pretty cool job for a bunch of reasons. You got a much nicer uniform than a common soldier. You got to stand behind the firing line, which is always pretty good when there's bullets flying around. You also had to deliver the cat of nine tails. You actually swung the whip, which might not make it popular with the foot soldiers. You also had to pull the casualties out of the battle. So there were drummer boys back then, but most of the drummers in the Army are actually older soldiers. You had all these other jobs to do. And you had to be able to play the fife, play the drum, and you had to be able to play the bugle. And you had to memorize dozens of different calls, because everything a soldier did, from getting up in the morning to eating dinner, to firing his musket, there was a drum beat, a bugle call, or a fife call. So they're like the communication system of the battle. In the light infantry out here, you're going to hear two things. You're going to hear a bugle. The bugle is just easier to carry than a drum. And it's better than a fife because you only need one hand to play it. And you'll also also hear whistles being blown. So the sergeants in the light infantry would carry a whistle. If they wanted their soldiers to do something, there's different signal calls for the whistle that would get them to maneuver and fire the musket. And to this day, a modern Canadian infantry sergeant still gets issued a whistle to give commands to soldiers in the field. The Battle of Cook's Mills on the 19th of October, 1814. That first engagement was between the Canadian guys in the Glengarry Light Infantry and soldiers of the United States 5th Infantry. That night, things simmer down, but at 7 a.m. the battle gets underway again, when the green-jacketed Glengarrys and the redcoats of the 82nd are forced to push the Americans out of that ravine. But they get some reinforcements from Chippewa. Guys from the 100th Regiment of Foot, the 104th, which is the New Brunswick Regiment. Any New Brunswickers here? New Brunswick. They put up a pretty good fight in this battle. The Americans have the 5th, the 14th, 15th, and the 16th U.S. Infantry. So for about an hour or two, the light infantry are taking pot shots at each other. The British do get artillery into play, and as one of the American units is getting organized, the Royal Marine Artillery fires a volley of rockets into the ranks, inflicting casualties and disrupting the Americans' line. So you'll see on the field there's green-coated Glengarrys, soldiers of the 82nd, the 104th, and the 100th. So the Americans are getting outnumbered here. It looks like they're going to have to fall back. There's too many redcoats. Now the redcoats and the U.S. infantry, as they come on the field, they're going to start firing in volleys. And that way you guarantee that something on the other side of the field is going to fall down, and that somebody's musket is going to work. It's also safer in close ranks if everybody fired together. With these flip-up muskets, flames come out the front, and flames come out the back. Now you have to tear off the end of the paper cartridge with your teeth, but if your file partner next to you fires his musket, he might set off the cartridge that's in your mouth. Now it won't blow off your head, but it's going to leave a really nasty mark. And obviously your friend isn't going to be happy with you. So it was just safer if everybody fired all together. Advantage of volley fire is it sends a very clear message to your enemy. And if the solid volleys were being fired, it sounded like little cannons going, and you were fighting disciplined soldiers. If it sounded like popcorn popping, you knew that you were up against the local county militia. Coming on the field right now, you'll see some folks in gray jackets wearing top hats. And on those top hats, they have a green band and a white cockade. Now they're in the American forces, but they're called the Canadian Volunteers. Oh good, we have some Canadian Volunteer fans here. That's nice to see. And the colorful stuff on their hat is sending a nasty message to their British enemies. The green band represents the Irish Rebellion of 1798, and the white cockade represents the House of Stuart.
All right.
The Scottish uprising of 1745. Now, there were thousands of Canadians who fought in the War of 1812, and only probably 200 ended up in the Canadian Volunteers. They fight very well for their American friends, but of course, if they get caught by the Redcoats, their life is going to be pretty miserable and short.
Oh, is that what you do?
So it looks like the Americans are taking cover behind a split rail fence, daring the Redcoats to come closer. Split rails in Upper Canada didn't survive the war much. They were usually used for crossing, or you use them as bedding so you weren't laying in the mud. And in battle, you stack them up with rocks and dirt, so they become a bulletproof obstacle. So that sound to a British commander would tell him that the Americans he's fighting are well-trained and disciplined and organized. And the fighting on October the 19th, 1814 is very much between professional troops. We've had a couple of years of hard lessons in this style of warfare. And I see some green-coated Canadians coming across the field.
Yay!
Every province was expected to raise a full-time. And those green-coated fellas are the Glengarry Light Infantry. They were Upper Canada's full-time fighting force. Now they wear green instead of red because they were used as troops and they fought alongside their native allies. The native warriors called these guys the Black Stumps because of the black caps they wore. And many of the fencible regiments that were raised in the provinces are well known today. The Royal Newfoundland Regiment, the New Brunswick Regiment, the Nova Scotia Regiment are still around today. But wearing a green jacket, Glengarry Light Infantry, was nothing new. During the American Revolutionary War, many of the Loyalist troops wore Tory green. And the Niagara Peninsula was first settled by former Butler's Rangers who fought against George Washington and his fellows. And Grandpa might have even served in Rogers Rangers, who also wore green during the French and Indian War. But again, on a big smoky battlefield, that green jacket could be a bit of a liability if people don't know who you are in the smoke. At the Battle of Cook's Mills, the British tried to push the Americans out of that ravine, but they quickly realized they were going to be outnumbered. The American commander was very deliberate in his actions. So he sent the regiment straight at the Redcoats. He sent another around on the left flank. Basically, we're shooting the warriors today. He sent another regiment on the south side of Lions Creek to fire into the British flank.
No, that's all right.
looks like the one of the British officers is offering a parley with one of the Americans. There were times throughout the war where they were rather gentlemanly and would discuss the exchange of prisoners, how to deal with the wounded. The year 1814 was not filled with a lot of nice discussions, though. It was mainly vicious, knockdown battles. Going to meet again in some time as friends. And he then hugged each of the American officers' daughters and said he was going to miss his rosy-cheeked Yankees. And about a week later, they were enemies. Now those are professional soldiers who were friends, but there were families on both sides of the border, and this was not a conflict that anybody wanted, not locally around here. And in fact, it destroyed so many communities along the Niagara River, western New York, and on the Niagara Peninsula. It took years for people to rebuild. Now, we've had a bit of fun today. We've blown off some gunpowder. I hope the people who wanted to have a relaxing, quiet Sunday afternoon don't mind the fact that we came into their neighborhood. But of course, Cook's Mills is a battlefield. And at the end of October the 19th, over 100 men had been killed or wounded in a farmer's field and in that ravine on the north side of Lions Creek. So at this time, this is where we ask folks, if you'd like to stand or doff your cap, the drum major and his drummers will be playing a lament to honor those who fell 200 years ago today, October 19th, 1814. Now, ladies and gentlemen, give a rip-roaring round of applause for all these volunteers. Now, we invite you to stick around because usually the troops form up and they do a bit of a march past. That's their way of thanking you for coming here today. Again, you're welcome to hang out, have a bite to eat, do a little bit of shopping. Of course, you can put a loonie or toonie or a buck or two in those buckets as they come around. point and salute and serve